Chapter 43, Grand Mass Meeting of the Women of Utah on Polygamy and the Cullum Bill, their noble remonstrance, speeches of apostolic women, their resolutions, women's rights or women's revolution. Probably the most remarkable women's rights demonstration of the age was that of the women of Mormondom in their Grand Mass meetings held throughout Utah, in all its principal cities and settlements, in January of 1870. And it was the more singular and complex because Utah is the land of polygamy, the only land in all Christendom where that institution has been established, and that, too, chiefly by an Anglo-Saxon people, the last race in the world that the sociologist might have supposed would have received the system of plural marriage. Hence, they have lifted it to a plane that, perhaps, no other race could have done, above mere sexual considerations, and, in its theories, altogether incompatible with the serfdom of woman. For the tens of thousands of the women of Utah not only held their Grand Mass meetings to confirm and maintain polygamy, but they did it at the very moment of the passage of their female suffrage bill, so that in their vast assemblages they were virtually exercising their vote. On the 13th of January, 1870, notwithstanding the inclemency of the weather, the old tabernacle, says the Deseret News, was densely packed with ladies of all ages, and, as that building will comfortably seat 5,000 persons, there could not have been fewer than between 5,000 and 6,000 present on the occasion. It was announced in the program that there were to be none present but ladies. Several reporters of the press, however, obtained admittance, among whom was Colonel Finley Anderson, special correspondent of the New York Herald. The meeting was opened with a very impressive prayer from Mrs. Zena D. Young, and then, on motion of Eliza R. Snow, Mrs. Sarah M. Kimball was elected president. Mrs. Lydia Alder was chosen secretary, and Mrs. M. T. Smoot, Mrs. M. N. Hyde, Isabella Horn, Mary Lever, Priscilla Staines, and Rachel Grant were appointed a committee to draft resolutions. This was done with executive dispatch, for many present had for years been leaders of women's organizations. The president arose and addressed a few pithy remarks to the vast assemblage. She said, "We are to speak in relation to the government and institutions under which we live." She would ask, "Have we transgressed any law of the United States?" Loud no from the audience. "Then why are we here today?" "We have been driven from place to place, and wherefore?" "Simply for believing and practicing the counsels of God as contained in the gospel of heaven." The object of this meeting is to consider the justice of a bill now before the Congress of the United States. We are not here to advocate women's rights, but man's rights. The bill in question would not only deprive our fathers, husbands, and brothers of enjoying the privileges bequeathed to citizens of the United States, but it would deprive us as women of the privilege of selecting our husbands. And against this we unqualifiedly protest. During the absence of the Committee on Resolutions, the following speech was delivered by Bathsheba W. Smith. "Beloved sisters and friends, it is with no ordinary feelings that I meet with you on the present occasion. From my early youth I have been identified with the Latter-day Saints, hence, I have been an eye and ear witness to many of the wrongs that have been inflicted upon our people by a spirit of intolerant persecution. I watched by the bedside of the first apostle, David W. Patton, who fell a martyr in the church. He was a noble soul. He was shot by a mob while defending the saints in the state of Missouri. As Brother Patton's lifeblood oozed away, I stood by and heard his dying testimony to the truth of our holy religion, declaring himself to be a friend to all mankind. His last words, addressed to his wife, were, 'Whatever you do, do not deny the faith.' This circumstance made a lasting impression on my youthful mind. I was intimately acquainted with the life and ministry of our beloved prophet Joseph and our patriarch Hiram Smith. I know that they were pure men who labored for the redemption of the human family. For 6 years I heard their public and private teachings. It was from their lips that I heard taught the principle of celestial marriage, and when I saw their mangled forms cold in death, having been slain for the testimony of Jesus by the hands of cruel bigots in defiance of law, justice, and executive pledges, and although this was a scene of barbarous cruelty, which can never be erased from the memory of those who witnessed the heartrending cries of widows and orphans, and mingled their tears with those of thousands of witnesses of the mournful occasion, the memories of which I hardly feel willing to awaken. Yet I realized that they had sealed their ministry with their blood, and that their testimony was in force. On the 9th day of February, 1846, the middle of a cold and bleak winter, my husband, just rising from a bed of sickness, and I, in company with thousands of saints, were driven again from our comfortable home. The accumulation of 6 years' industry and prudence, and, with the little children, commenced a long and weary journey through a wilderness, to seek another home, for a wicked mob had decreed we must leave. Governor Ford of Illinois said the laws were powerless to protect us. Exposed to the cold of winter and the storms of spring, we continued our journey, amid want and exposure, burying by the wayside a dead mother, a son, and many kind friends and relatives. We reached the Missouri River in July. Here our country thought proper to make a requisition upon us for a battalion to defend our national flag in the war pending with Mexico. We responded promptly, many of our kindred stepping forward and performing a journey characterized by their commanding officer as unparalleled in history. With most of our youths and middle-aged men gone, we could not proceed. Hence, we were compelled to make another home, which, though humble, approaching winter made very desirable. In 1847–8, all who were able, through selling their surplus property, proceeded. We who remained were told, by an unfeeling Indian department, we must vacate our houses and recross the Missouri River. As the laws would not permit us to remain on Indian lands, we obeyed and again made a new home, though only a few miles distant. The latter home we abandoned in 1849 for the purpose of joining our co-religionists in the then far-off region, denominated on the map the Great American Desert, and by some later geographies as Eastern Upper California. In this isolated country we made new homes and, for a time, contended with the crickets for a scanty subsistence. The rude, ignorant, and almost nude Indians were a heavy tax upon us, while struggling again to make comfortable homes and improvements, yet we bore it all without complaint, for we were buoyed up with the happy reflections that we were so distant from the States, and had found an asylum in such an undesirable country, as to strengthen us in the hope that our homes would not be coveted, and that should we, through the blessing of God, succeed in planting our own vine and fig tree, no one could feel heartless enough to withhold from us that religious liberty which we had sought in vain amongst our former neighbors. Without recapitulating our recent history, the development of a people whose industry and morality have extorted eulogy from their bitter traducers, I cannot but express my surprise, mingled with regret and indignation, at the recent efforts of ignorant, bigoted, and unfeeling men, headed by the Vice President, to aid intolerant sectarians and reckless speculators who seek for proscription and plunder, and who feel willing to rob the inhabitants of these valleys of their hard-earned possessions and, what is dearer, the constitutional boon of religious liberty. Sister Smith was followed by Mrs. Levi Ryder in a few appropriate remarks, and then the Committee on Resolutions reported the following: resolved, that we, the ladies of Salt Lake City, in mass meeting assembled, do manifest our indignation and protest against the bill before Congress, known as the Cullum Bill, also the one known as the Cragen Bill, and all similar bills, expressions, and manifestos. Resolved, that we consider the above-named bills foul blots on our national escutcheon, absurd documents, atrocious insults to the honorable executive of the United States government, and malicious attempts to subvert the rights of civil and religious liberty. Resolved, that we do hold sacred the Constitution bequeathed us by our forefathers and ignore, with laudable womanly jealousy, every act of those men to whom the responsibilities of government have been entrusted, which is calculated to destroy its efficiency. Resolved, that we unitedly exercise every moral power and every right which we inherit as the daughters of American citizens to prevent the passage of such bills, knowing that they would inevitably cast a stigma on our Republican government by jeopardizing the liberty and lives of its most loyal and peaceful citizens. Resolved, that, in our candid opinion, the presentation of the aforesaid bills indicates a manifest degeneracy of the great men of our nation, and their adoption would presage a speedy downfall and ultimate extinction of the glorious pedestal of freedom, protection, and equal rights established by our noble ancestors. Resolved, that we acknowledge the institutions of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints as the only reliable safeguard of female virtue and innocence, and the only sure protection against the fearful sin of prostitution and its attendant evils, now prevalent abroad, and as such, we are and shall be united with our brethren in sustaining them against each and every encroachment. Resolved, that we consider the originators of the aforesaid bills disloyal to the Constitution and unworthy of any position of trust in any office which involves the interests of our nation. Resolved, that, in case the bills in question should pass both houses of Congress and become a law, by which we shall be disfranchised as a territory, we, the ladies of Salt Lake City, shall exert all our power and influence to aid in the support of our own state government. These resolutions were greeted with loud cheers from nearly 6,000 women and carried unanimously, after which Sister Warren Smith, a relict of one of the martyrs of Hans Mill, arose and with deep feeling said, "Sisters, as I sat upon my seat, listening, it seemed as though, if I held my peace, the stones of the streets would cry out. With your prayers aiding me, I will try and make a few remarks." See chapter on Hans Mill Massacre, in which Sister Smith substantially covers the same ground. We are here today to say, if such scenes shall be again enacted in our midst. I say to you, my sisters, you are American citizens. Let us stand by the truth, if we die for it. Mrs. Wilmarth East then said, "It is with feelings of pleasure, mingled with indignation and disgust, that I appear before my sisters to express my feelings in regard to the Cullum Bill, now before the Congress of this once happy Republican government. The Constitution for which our forefathers fought and bled and died bequeaths to us the right of religious liberty, the right to worship God according to the dictates of our own consciences. Does the Cullum Bill give us this right? Compare it with the Constitution, if you please, and see what a disgrace has come upon this once happy and Republican government. Where, oh, where, is that liberty, bequeathed to us by our forefathers, the richest boon ever given to man or woman, except eternal life or the gospel of the Son of God? I am an American citizen by birth. Having lived under the laws of the land, I claim the right to worship God according to the dictates of my conscience and the commandments that God shall give unto me. Our Constitution guarantees life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness to all who live beneath it. What is life to me, if I see the galling yoke of oppression placed on the necks of my husband, sons, and brothers, as Mr. Cullum would have it? I am proud to say to you that I am not only a citizen of the United States of America, but a citizen of the kingdom of God, and the laws of this kingdom I am willing to sustain and defend both by example and precept. I am thankful today that I have the honored privilege of being the happy recipient of one of the greatest principles ever revealed to man for his redemption and exaltation in the kingdom of God, namely, plurality of wives. And I am thankful today that I know that God is at the helm and will defend his people. A veteran sister, Mrs. McMinn, could not refrain from expressing herself in unison with her sisters in indignation at the bill. She was an American citizen. Her father had fought through the Revolution with General Washington, and she claimed the exercise of the liberty for which he had fought. She was proud of being a Latter-day Saint. In answer to an inquiry, she stated that she was nearly 85 years of age. Sister Eliza R. Snow then addressed the meeting as follows. My sisters, in addressing you at this time, I realize that the occasion is a peculiar and interesting one. We are living in a land of freedom, under a constitution that guarantees civil and religious liberty to all, black and white, Christians, Jews, Mohammedans, and pagans. And how strange it is that such considerations should exist as those which have called us together this afternoon. Under the proud banner which now waves from ocean to ocean, strange as it may seem, we, who have ever been loyal citizens, have been persecuted from time to time and driven from place to place, until at last, beyond the bounds of civilization, under the guidance of President Young, we found an asylum of peace in the midst of these mountains. There are, at times, small and apparently trivial events in the lives of individuals with which every other event naturally associates. There are circumstances in the history of nations which serve as centers around which everything else revolves. The entrance of our brave pioneers and the settlement of the Latter-day Saints in these mountain valleys, which then were only barren, savage wilds, are events with which not only our own future, but the future of the whole world, is deeply associated. Here they struggled, with more than mortal energy, for their hearts and hands were nerved by the Spirit of the Most High, and through His blessing they succeeded in drawing sustenance from the arid soil. Here they erected the standard on which the Star-Spangled Banner waved its salutation of welcome to the nations of the earth, and here it will be bequeathed, unsullied, to future generations. Yes, that dear old flag, which in my girlhood I always contemplated with joyous pride, and to which the patriotic strains of my earliest muse were chanted, here floats triumphantly on the mountain breeze. Our numbers, small at first, have increased, until now we number 150,000, and yet we are allowed only a territorial government. Year after year we have petitioned Congress for that which is our inalienable right to claim, a state government, and, year after year, our petitions have been treated with contempt. Such treatment as we have received from our rulers has no precedent in the annals of history. And now, instead of granting us our rights as American citizens, bills are being presented to Congress, which are a disgrace to men in responsible stations, professing the least claim to honor and magnanimity, bills which, if carried into effect, would utterly annihilate us as a people. But this will never be. There's too much virtue yet existing in the nation, and above all there is a God in heaven whose protecting care is over us, and who takes cognizance of the acts of men. My sisters, we have met today to manifest our views and feelings concerning the oppressive policy exercised towards us by our Republican government. Aside from all local and personal feelings, to me it is a source of deep regret that the standard of American liberty should have been so far swayed from its original position, as to have given rise to circumstances which not only render such a meeting opportune, but absolutely necessary. Heretofore, while detraction and ridicule have been poured forth in almost every form that malice could invent, while we have been misrepresented by speech and press, and exhibited in every shade but our true light, the ladies of Utah have remained comparatively silent. Had not our aims been of the most noble and exalted character, and had we not known that we occupied a standpoint far above our traducers, we might have returned volley for volley. But we have all the time realized that to contradict such egregious absurdities would be a great stoop of condescension, far beneath the dignity of those who profess to be saints of the living God, and we very unassumingly applied to ourselves the saying of an ancient apostle, in writing to the Corinthians, "Ye suffer fools, gladly, seeing that yourselves are wise." But there is a point at which silence is no longer a virtue. In my humble opinion, we have arrived at that point. Ought we, to be silent when every right of citizenship, every vestige of civil and religious liberty is at stake? When our husbands and sons, our fathers and brothers, are threatened with being either restrained in their obedience to the commands of God or incarcerated, year after year, in the dreary confines of a prison, will it be thought presumptuous? Ladies, this subject as deeply interests us as them. In the kingdom of God, woman has no interests separate from those of man, all are mutual. Our enemies pretend that, in Utah, woman is held in a state of vassalage, that she does not act from choice, but by coercion, that we would even prefer life elsewhere, were it possible for us to make our escape. What nonsense! We all know that if we wished we could leave at any time either to go singly or to rise en masse, and there is no power here that could, or would wish to, prevent us. I will now ask this assemblage of intelligent ladies, do you know of any place on the face of the earth where woman has more liberty, and where she enjoys such high and glorious privileges as she does here, as a Latter-day Saint? No. The very idea of woman here in a state of slavery is a burlesque on good common sense. The history of this people, with a very little reflection, would instruct outsiders on this point. It would show, at once, that the part which woman has acted in it could never have been performed against her will. Amid the many distressing scenes through which we have passed, the privations and hardships consequent upon our expulsion from state to state, and our location in an isolated, barren wilderness. The women in this church have performed and suffered what could never have been borne and accomplished by slaves. And now, after all that has transpired, can our opponents expect us to look on with silent indifference and see every vestige of that liberty for which many of our patriotic grandsires fought and bled, that they might bequeath to us, their children? The precious boon of national freedom wrested from our grasp? They must be very dull in estimating the energy of female character, who can persuade themselves that women who for the sake of their religion left their homes, crossed the plains with handcarts, or, as many had previously done, drove ox, mule and horse teams from Nauvoo and from other points, when their husbands and sons went, at their country's call, to fight her battles in Mexico. Yes, that very country which had refused us protection, and from which we were then struggling to make our escape. I say those who think that such women and the daughters of such women do not possess too much energy of character to remain passive and mute under existing circumstances, are reckoning without their host. To suppose that we should not be aroused when our brethren are threatened with fines and imprisonment for their faith in and obedience to the laws of God is an insult to our womanly natures. Were we the stupid, degraded, heartbroken beings that we have been represented, silence might better become us. But as women of God, women filling high and responsible positions, performing sacred duties, women who stand not as dictators, but as counselors to their husbands, and who, in the purest, noblest sense of refined womanhood, are truly their helpmates, we not only speak because we have the right, but justice and humanity demand that we should. My sisters, let us, inasmuch as we are free to do all that love and duty prompt, be brave and unfaltering in sustaining our brethren. Woman's faith can accomplish wonders. Let us, like the devout and steadfast Miriam, assist our brothers in upholding the hands of Moses. Like the loving Josephine, whose firm and gentle influence both animated and soothed the heart of Napoleon, we will encourage and assist the servants of God in establishing righteousness. But unlike Josephine, never will political inducements, threats or persecutions prevail on us to relinquish our matrimonial ties. They were performed by the authority of the holy priesthood, the efficiency of which extends into eternity. But to the law and to the testimony, those obnoxious, fratricidal bills, I feel indignant at the thought that such documents should disgrace our national legislature. The same spirit prompted Herod to seek the life of Jesus, the same that drove our pilgrim fathers to this continent, and the same that urged the English government to the system of unrepresented taxation, which resulted in the independence of the American colonies, is conspicuous in those bills. If such measures are persisted in, they will produce similar results. They not only threaten extirpation to us, but they augur destruction to the government. The authors of those bills would tear the Constitution to shreds. They are sapping the foundation of American freedom. They would obliterate every vestige of the dearest right of man, liberty of conscience, and reduce our once happy country to a state of anarchy. Our trust is in God. He who led Israel from the land of Egypt, who preserved Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace, who rescued Daniel from the jaws of hungry lions, and who directed Brigham Young to these mountain valleys, lives, and overrules the destinies of men and nations. He will make the wrath of man praise him, and his kingdom will move steadily forward, until wickedness shall be swept from the earth and truth, love, and righteousness reign triumphantly. Next came a concise, powerful speech from Harriet Cook Young. She said, "In rising to address this meeting, delicacy prompts me to explain the chief motives which have dictated our present action. We, the ladies of Salt Lake City, have assembled here today, not for the purpose of assuming any particular political power, nor to claim any special prerogative which may or may not belong to our sex, but to express our indignation at the unhallowed efforts of men who, regardless of every principle of manhood, justice, and constitutional liberty, would force upon a religious community, by a direct issue, either the course of apostasy or the bitter alternative of fire and sword. Surely the instinct of self-preservation, the love of liberty and happiness, and the right to worship God are dear to our sex as well as to the other, and when these most sacred of all rights are thus wickedly assailed, it becomes absolutely our duty to defend them. The mission of the Latter-day Saints is to reform abuses which have for ages corrupted the world and to establish an era of peace and righteousness. The Most High is the founder of this mission, and in order to its establishment, His providences have so shaped the world's history that, on this continent, blessed above all other lands, a free and enlightened government has been instituted, guaranteeing to all social, political, and religious liberty. The Constitution of our country is therefore hallowed to us, and we view with a jealous eye every infringement upon its great principles and demand, in the sacred name of liberty, that the miscreant who would trample it under his feet by depriving 100,000 American citizens of every vestige of liberty should be anathematized throughout the length and breadth of the land as a traitor to God and his country. It is not strange that, among the bigoted and corrupt, such a man and such a measure should have originated, but it will be strange indeed if such a measure find favor with the honorable and high-minded men who wield the destinies of the nation. Let this seal of ruin be attached to the archives of our country, and terrible must be the results. Woe will wait upon her steps, and war and desolation will stalk through the land. Peace and liberty will seek another clime, while anarchy, lawlessness, and bloody strife hold high carnival amid the general wreck. God forbid that wicked men be permitted to force such an issue upon the nation. It is true that a corrupt press and an equally corrupt priestcraft are leagued against us, that they have pandered to the ignorance of the masses and vilified our institutions, to that degree that it has become popular to believe that the Latter-day Saints are unworthy to live. But it is also true that there are many, very many, right-thinking men who are not without influence in the nation, and to such do we now most solemnly and earnestly appeal. Let the united force of this assembly give the lie to the popular clamor that the women of Utah are oppressed and held in bondage. Let the world know that the women of Utah prefer virtue to vice, and the home of an honorable wife to the gilded pageantry of fashionable temples of sin. Transitory allurements, glaring the senses as is the flame to the moth, short-lived and cruel in their results, possess no charms for us. Every woman in Utah may have her husband, the husband of her choice. Here we are taught not to destroy our children, but to preserve them, for they, reared in the path of virtue and trained to righteousness, constitute our true glory. It is with no wish to accuse our sisters who are not of our faith that we so speak, but we are dealing with facts as they exist. Wherever monogamy reigns, adultery, prostitution, and foeticide, directly or indirectly, are its concomitants. It is not enough to say that the virtuous and high-minded frown upon these evils. We believe they do. But frowning upon them does not cure them. It does not even check their rapid growth. Either the remedy is too weak or the disease is too strong. The women of Utah comprehend this, and they see, in the principle of plurality of wives, the only safeguard against adultery, prostitution, and the reckless waste of prenatal life, practiced throughout the land. It is as co-workers in the great mission of universal reform, not only in our own behalf, but also, by precept and example, to aid in the emancipation of our sex generally, that we accept in our heart of hearts what we know to be a divine commandment, and here, and now, boldly and publicly, we do assert our right, not only to believe in this holy commandment, but to practice what we believe. While these are our views, every attempt to force that obnoxious measure upon us must of necessity be an attempt to coerce us in our religious and moral convictions, against which did we not most solemnly protest. We would be unworthy the name of American women. Mrs. Hannah T. King followed with a stinging address to General Cullum himself. She said, "My dear sisters, I wish I had the language I feel to need, at the present moment, to truly represent the indignant feelings of my heart and brain on reading, as I did last evening, a string of 30 sections, headed by the words, 'A bill in aid of the execution of the laws in the territory of Utah and for other purposes.' The other purposes contain the pith of the matter, and the adamantine chains that the author of the said bill seeks to bind this people with exceed anything that the feudal times of England, or the serfdom of Russia, ever laid upon human beings. My sisters, are we really in America, the world-renowned land of liberty, freedom, and equal rights, the land of which I dreamed, in my youth as being almost an earthly Elysium, where freedom of thought and religious liberty were open to all. The land that Columbus wore his noble life out to discover, the land that God himself helped him to exhume, and to aid which endeavor Isabella, a queen, a woman, declared she would pawn her jewels and crown of Castile to give him the outfit that he needed, the land of Washington, the father of his country, and a host of noble spirits, too numerous to mention, the land to which the Mayflower bore the Pilgrim Fathers, who rose up and left their homes, and bade their native home good night, simply that they might worship God by a purer and holier faith, in a land of freedom and liberty, of which the name America has long been synonymous. Yes, my sisters, this is America, but oh, how are the mighty fallen? Who or what is the creature who framed this incomparable document? Is he an Eskimo or a chimpanzee? What isolated land or spot produced him? What ideas he must have of women? Had he ever a mother, a wife, or a sister? In what academy was he tutored, or to what school does he belong, that he so cruelly and systematically commands the women of this people to turn traitors to their husbands, their brothers, and their sons? Short-sighted man of sections and the bill. Let us, the women of this people, the sisterhood of Utah, rise en masse, and tell this nondescript to defer the bill until he has studied the character of woman, such as God intended she should be. Then he will discover that devotion, veneration, and faithfulness are her peculiar attributes, that God is her refuge, and his servants her oracles, and that, especially, the women of Utah have paid too high a price for their present position, their present light and knowledge, and their noble future, to succumb to so mean and foul a thing as Baskin, Cullum, and Company's bill. Let him learn that they are one in heart, hand, and brain, with the brotherhood of Utah, that God is their father and their friend, that into his hands they commit their cause, and on their pure and simple banner they have emblazoned their motto, God and my right. The next who spoke was Phoebe Woodruff, who said, "Ladies of Utah, as I have been called upon to express my views upon the important subject which has called us together, I will say that I am happy to be one of your number in this association. I am proud that I am a citizen of Utah and a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I have been a member of this church for 36 years and had the privilege of living in the days of the prophet Joseph and heard his teaching for many years. He ever counseled us to honor, obey, and maintain the principles of our noble Constitution, for which our fathers fought, and which many of them sacrificed their lives to establish. President Brigham Young has always taught the same principle. This glorious legacy of our fathers, the Constitution of the United States, guarantees unto all the citizens of this great republic the right to worship God according to the dictates of their own consciences, as it expressly says, Congress shall make no laws respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Cullum's bill is in direct violation of this declaration of the Constitution, and I think it is our duty to do all in our power, by our voices and influence, to thwart the passage of this bill, which commits a violent outrage upon our rights, and the rights of our fathers, husbands, and sons, and whatever may be the final result of the action of Congress in passing or enforcing oppressive laws for the sake of our religion. Upon the noble men who have subdued these deserts, it is our duty to stand by them and support them by our faith, prayers, and works, through every dark hour unto the end, and trust in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to defend us and all who are called to suffer for keeping the commandments of God. Shall we, as wives and mothers, sit still and see our husbands and sons, whom we know are obeying the highest behest of heaven, suffer for their religion, without exerting ourselves to the extent of our power for their deliverance? No, verily no. God has revealed unto us the law of the patriarchal order of marriage, and commanded us to obey it. We are sealed to our husbands for time and eternity, that we may dwell with them and our children in the world to come, which guarantees unto us the greatest blessing for which we are created. If the rulers of the nation will so far depart from the spirit and letter of our glorious Constitution as to deprive our prophets, apostles, and elders of citizenship, and imprison them for obeying this law, let them grant this, our last request, to make their prisons large enough to hold their wives, for where they go we will go also. Sisters M. I. Horn and Eleanor M. Pratt followed with appropriate words, and then Sister Eliza R. Snow made the following remarks. My remarks in conclusion will be brief. I heard the prophet Joseph Smith say, if the people rose and mobbed us and the authorities countenanced it, they would have mobs to their heart's content. I heard him say that the time would come when this nation would so far depart from its original purity, its glory, and its love of freedom and protection of civil and religious rights, that the Constitution of our country would hang as it were by a thread. He said, also, that this people, the sons of Zion, would rise up and save the Constitution and bear it off triumphantly. The spirit of freedom and liberty we should always cultivate, and it is what mothers should inspire in the breasts of their sons, that they may grow up brave and noble, and defenders of that glorious Constitution which has been bequeathed unto us. Let mothers cultivate that spirit in their own bosoms. Let them manifest their own bravery and cherish a spirit of encountering difficulties, because they have to be met, more or less, in every situation of life. If fortitude and nobility of soul be cultivated in your own bosoms, you will transmit them to your children. Your sons will grow up noble defenders of truth and righteousness, and heralds of salvation to the nations of the earth. They will be prepared to fill high and responsible religious, judicial, civil, and executive positions. I consider it most important, my sisters, that we should struggle to preserve the sacred Constitution of our country, one of the blessings of the Almighty, for the same spirit that inspired Joseph Smith inspired the framers of the Constitution, and we should ever hold it sacred and bear it off triumphantly. Mrs. Zena D. Young then moved that the meeting adjourn sine die, which was carried, and Mrs. Phoebe Woodruff pronounced the benediction.